Hello everybody and welcome to Toitu to You Curator's Corner episode number 34. My name's Sean Brosnan. I'm a curator at Toitu Otago Settlers Museum here in Dunedin, and I've been making these little stories about pioneer life in our city. Now for today's story we're going to stick with Squatters Gully that was introduced in the last episode and the focus on the Buchanan family, but we're going to leave aside John Buchanan, the head of the household, and turn our attention to his wife Margaret. Now, how did she experience the wrench of leaving her close-knit family in Kirkintilloch to go to the far side of the world in 1847-48? And what was her experience of life in those first couple of years? Well, there's a hint in John's letter from November 1849. Margaret was not very well during the later end of the winter and the beginning of spring, but is now a good deal better. She is very anxious to know how her relatives are getting on. Now, this was probably playing down what had been a very difficult period for Margaret Buchanan. She had, in fact, had an extremely hard time in her first year in New Zealand. Now, a quite wonderful family history that we have in the Toitu archives, which is based on letters from Margaret's family back in Scotland and the memoirs of her daughter Isabella, tells us that after their arrival in Otago in April 1848, Margaret was very miserable and became quite depressed. A family story recounts how she finally broke through this depression when she went out harvesting, no doubt in the springtime of 1849, and probably at the Burns property being developed at Grant's Braes across the harbour at what's now Vauxhall or Waverley. This cheered her up mightily and reconciled her finally to her new life in New Zealand. Margaret Buchanan was born as Margaret McCulloch in the small settlement, a cluster of cottages called Dunty just on the outskirts of Kirkintilloch, which is that small village not far away from Glasgow. She came from a very large family, 13 siblings in fact, including a large number of sisters, but she was the only one of the family to leave Scotland and emigrate. And going to New Zealand, as far as you could go in the whole world from Scotland, meant being sundered forever from that close, extended family network. Margaret had married John Buchanan in 1843 when he was 40 and she was 36. So that made him considerably older than the usual age for Scottish people to be getting married in that period. It also made her rather old to be having her first child when she gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, in 1844. Now, by the time they left for New Zealand, in 1847, she had also given birth to another daughter, Jeannie, in fact in August, just 3 months before they departed on the ship from Greenock for Otago. So that meant that as the ship sailed away, Margaret was there on board with a 3-year-old and a 3-month-old to look after. Now just think of that for a moment in the context of the cramped and unpleasant conditions of the steerage compartment of an immigrant ship. Come and sit in our replica at Toitu if you want a very pale facsimile of what that meant. Now, add the challenge of breastfeeding baby Jeannie while keeping an eye on toddler Isabella. Or what about changing nappies? Or comforting the 2 little girls through the horrors of a violent storm on the high seas, an experience that absolutely terrified the adult passengers, according to surviving diary accounts. 5 months later, the Philip Lang finally reached Port Chalmers, but what came next? Well, as John Buchanan recounts in his letter home 18 months later, Margaret and the little girls were stuck there in their bunk on the ship at anchor in Port Chalmers for another 2 months before the barracks were ready for them in Dunedin. Watch episode 5 of this series if you want a reminder of how primitive conditions were there. And I'll quote again from Thomas Burns' description of how depressing he found it to see the misery of the women with young children when he preached at the barracks. I went to preach the bulk of the people in a long barracks made of grass and rushes, situated on the beach. I found my fellow passengers sitting in almost total darkness, the rain pouring through the roof, the floor in a miserable condition, women with young children on their knees, mid-leg deep in mire and puddle. In all my life, I never preached with so sad a heart. Well, Margaret Buchanan was one of those women, and Isabella and Jeannie were two of the little children in the mud and the mire. No wonder she got a bit depressed. So too, perhaps, after the uplifting experience of that springtime harvest in 1849 would have been the joy of moving into this cottage in Squatters Gully that John had laboured so long and hard to construct for his family. Having a place of their own must have been a wonderful relief, even if it was a far cry from the old established stone cottages back in Kirkintilloch. Now, we make some subtle references to Margaret's experiences in the replica setting of our cottage at Toitū. That irritating noise of a baby crying in the audio soundscape that plays in the background is supposed to put you on edge and just hint at Margaret's and all those other mothers' miseries in 1848 and 1849. Likewise, the subdued conversation you can hear between two women with Lowland Scots accents reminds us of the solidarity and support offered by the other women who lived in Squatters Gully and who took the place as best they could of Margaret's sisters back in Scotland. And finally, the beautiful singing in a woman's voice of Robert Burns' classic song, The Banks and Braes of Bonnie Doon, refers us to Margaret and a friend of hers who occasionally walked over the hills to the Taieri to visit with friends and relations who had settled there. Margaret apparently had a fine voice, and the two women used to sing for their supper, as it were, as they went from house to house.